With all that is going on in Iraq these days, I suspect it won't be long before we see the emergence of some remarkable books on the subject of war in Iraq. War is such a great subject. As Ernest Hemingway noted in a letter to F. Scott Fitzgerald, quote, "War is the best subject of all. It groups the maximum of material and speeds up the action and brings out all kinds of stuff you have to wait a lifetime to get. What made Three Soldiers a swell book was the war. What made Streets of Night a lousy book was Boston." I quote Hemingway not only because one of today's speakers will speak about him, but also because the Kennedy Library is honored to hold the archives of Ernest Hemingway, an outgrowth of the friendship between First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy and Ernest Hemingway's fourth wife, Mary. If you want to see Ernest Hemingway's leather briefcase, or his ring made out of shrapnel from World War I injuries, or his letters to actress Marlene Dietrich, or his military medals, or the more than 300 drafts and redrafts of his major novels, novels from A Farewell to Arms to For Whom the Bell Tolls, come to the Kennedy Library and Museum. You'll find on the table in the hall more information about the Hemingway archives and a pamphlet about the Friends of the Hemingway collection, which I encourage you to join. We could really use your support. The writings of Hemingway on war have recently been edited and published by his grandson, Sean Hemingway, who joins us today. Mr. Hemingway, who holds a doctorate in classical art and archaeology from Bryn Mawr College, is the associate curator of the Department of Greek and Roman Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. His book, Hemingway on War, was recently published by Scribner's and includes Hemingway's writings on World War I, the Spanish Civil War, and World War II. The war in Vietnam sparked numerous novels, including what many could consider to be the classic of that war, Fields of Fire. We are honored to have with us today its author, James Webb, Jr., who also wrote A Sense of Honor and Lost Soldiers. Mr. Webb is a decorated Marine who served in Vietnam and was awarded the Navy Cross, the Silver Star Medal, 2 Bronze Star Medals, and 2 Purple Hearts. He went on to serve as Secretary of the Navy and Assistant Secretary of Defense, and today is a screenwriter-producer, a journalist, and a business consultant. We are also greatly honored to have with us today the man who is generally acknowledged to be the nation's leading historian on war and literature, retired University of Pennsylvania professor Paul Fussell. His landmark book on World War I, The Great War and Modern Memory, won both the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. In World War II, at the age of 21, Mr. Fussell led a rifle platoon in the 103rd Infantry Division and was severely wounded in France. And moderating today's conversation is the chair of Harvard University's Department of Comparative Literature, Susan Suleiman. Professor Suleiman is the C. Douglas Dillon Professor, and I have to say at the Kennedy Library, C. Douglas Dillon, as a member of President Kennedy's cabinet, holds a soft spot for us. She is the Dillon Professor of the Civilization of France, and her current work is on history and memory, including the Holocaust. After today's forum, all of our participants will be available to sign their books in our museum store. Professor Suleiman, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. So the way these forums work is that we have a conversation, and then all of you are invited to ask questions after that. And I guess I'll just point to the microphones that are there, so that when you ask your question, you can be heard by everybody. But let's start the conversation among us. And I thought I would begin by asking a question that everybody has ideas on, or at least I'm sure all the panelists do. Do you think that in order to write well about war, one has to have experienced it? Also, if that's the case, then, for example, Hemingway, he was in the First World War, he wrote A Farewell to Arms. He participated as a journalist and as a very involved witness in the Spanish Civil War. He wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls. He was also involved in writing about the Second World War, especially about D-Day. And then he wrote into the Across the River and Into the Trees. So Hemingway is almost like the absolute example of you participate and then you write. But is it, as close as that, or is it enough to have experienced war in some way to write about any war? What do you all think? Yes, Paul.
I think the question is hard to answer because Hemingway was an extremely complex character and had an amazing genius for imagining warfare. He was sort of in a war, but he was always a reporter. He never killed anybody in the war, thus building up a lifetime of phony guilt, if you like. He knew a great deal about war. And in his case, it wasn't necessary for him to shoot anybody with a rifle or to pull the cord on a howitzer. You don't get many people like that. So I would say, in general, Hemingway accepted, you would have to find people who fought in a war. James Jones is a good example, although he fought for only about 2 days.
Or Jim Webb, no?
Yeah.
I have a little bit different reaction to your question. And as you were asking it, I was going back to, first of all, the thought of what kind of writing. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to write. For instance, I just finished a book that we were talking about the history of the Scots-Irish people. And I have to go back to the Hadrian's Wall period. That's one type of writing. It's a different type of writing. But what I found, and Hemingway was mentioned by Dr. Fussell, and when I was learning how to write, I was reading Hemingway and Steinbeck and Faulkner a lot. And the thing that struck me about them as I was attempting to write novels is that their experiences were observed experiences. I mean, the power in their writing was through observation rather than, say, even academic study. Ernest Hemingway, I don't think, ever went to college. John Steinbeck did 1 semester at University of Colorado and got a C in English and won the Nobel Prize. Faulkner was essentially homeschooled in the classics, but never really went to formal education. But in terms of fiction, the power of observation is really important, however you obtain that experience. And then when you get into the sort of the belly-wrenching fiction of war about what it's like, it definitely makes a lot of difference if you've had to be in that situation.
Yeah. Well, did you want to talk about Hemingway, Sean?
I would just add, I think Jim's comment is very interesting, and Hemingway, as you were remarking, Hemingway was in World War I as an ambulance driver, right. But in Farewell to Arms, he writes about the retreat at Caporetto, and soldiers who were there who have read that those passages even believed, well, that's the way it was. And yet Hemingway wasn't there. He wasn't there at Caporetto and was able to write very convincingly about it through considerable research and as well as learning from his own experiences both in World War I before that and also later.
Right. I guess I had a slight ulterior motive in asking the question because one of the things that struck me was, well, okay, I'll say it now and we can talk about it later. One of the things that struck me was that when you think of the great war literature or literature about battle, there are very few women who have written it, right? I mean, so my first thought was, is it that women haven't experienced battle, at least historically? Now they are. And is that why? Or is it a guy thing? I mean, but we can talk about that in a minute. I wanted to ask another question first, which is, what is your favorite war novel? And the reason I'm asking that is that I was struck by something that Paul Fussell wrote in his book, The Great War in Modern Memory, that World War I was the war that ended in irony. It began in innocent excitement and ended in a terrible sense of disenchantment and irony. And what I'm wondering is, are the greatest war novels wars that celebrate heroism, or are they in fact all anti-war novels, or even worse, ironic, very harsh negative novels? And so I'm curious, what's your favorite war book?
My favorite war book is very easy. And on this occasion, it's a pleasure to answer the question. It's Farewell to Arms.
Ah.
It's a superb thing. When I was teaching English to students, I always began with the first paragraph of that book, and I would ask them to analyze the source of its beauty and its power. And the book remains one of the masterpieces of irony, which otherwise appears only in British writing somehow. So that's my favorite war book.
I would say Farewell to Arms is certainly my favorite Hemingway book. And the first page of Farewell to Arms is it's almost a Cezanne painting. You know, it's just so gloriously written. For me, I can't pick one because I think this type of writing again goes to different types of author thought and messages. For instance, Farewell to Arms certainly is one. All Quiet on the Western Front, I mean, gets into just the hopelessness that overtook soldiers after years and years of this sort of fighting. It was a beautifully written book. There is the first novel that of any consequence that I read when I got back from Vietnam was Once an Eagle by Anton Myrer, which really in many ways is America's War and Peace. He starts in 1916 and in a notional way gets all the way to Vietnam. The unfortunate thing about that book was it came out as a book of the month selection right after Tet 68, when our country was just so exhausted by war that it never got the attention that it really deserved. And I could probably name a couple of others, but those certainly are three.
Right. And do you have a favorite one, Sean?
For Whom the Bell Tolls would be my favorite. And I think, although Farewell to Arms is fantastic as well, in working on this book, Hemingway on War, rereading For Whom the Bell Tolls, it is such a powerful portrayal of war, the Spanish Civil War, portraying both the good and the bad of both sides. It captures the horrors that occur on both sides of a line. And yet it's a personal story of an individual within the war.
If I may, I really also I cannot neglect Killer Angels by Shara, which was written about the Battle of Gettysburg. And this was, when you're talking about translating experience, I mean, this was he was an airborne soldier who was able to translate one set of experiences into really get inside the minds of the both sides on.
There's also the Red Badge of Courage, right? I mean, or no?
And I would add that I believe Ernest Hemingway's favorite war book was Her Privates We by Frederick Manning.
Oh, okay. What about the idea that war novels are really anti-war novels? I mean, do you buy that? Do you like that? What about you, Jim? Since you write,
I'll give you an interesting observation. I think. Clearly, after a popular war, the books that cut against the grain of prevailing orthodoxy were the first ones to come out. After World War II, for instance, The
Naked and the Dead.
Naked and the Dead, and to a certain extent, From Here to Eternity. When I was trying to sell Fields of Fire, it was rejected by 12 publishers. And finally, the publisher, the editor that bought the book for Prentice Hall, which was a very small trade house at the time, wrote me a letter, and he said, all great war novels are those that cut against the grain of prevailing orthodoxy, which is where I just got that term. And Fields of Fire is not a political book, but it attempts to retain the dignity of the people who went through the experience. And at that point, after the Vietnam War, that was something that was really, if not fresh, sort of unusual. So, they don't, the great war novels don't necessarily have to be anti-war, although they do have to get into the emotions of the people who go through war.
Right. It sort of depict the pain as well as the sometimes really camaraderie, for example, is one of the things that I noticed, that men at war seem to establish a kind of a a friendship which is so strong, I guess because they are exposed to danger together. So that's the positive side, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I think to answer that question, we have to add the question, which war? Because some wars are more writable about and more awful than others. For example, before the Second World War, there was nothing like booby traps. Booby traps, anti-personnel mines devised to explode exactly at the height of a man's crotch. These are 20th century inventions which do us all dishonor. And it's a very different matter writing about that kind of war than, say, the war rendered by Stendhal or by Tolstoy, et cetera, or even by wonderful writers about the American Civil War. What I'm saying is that war gets worse. War gets worse as the years pass. Elements of sadism and black humor begin to enter, which were never there before. So it depends which war you are talking about, writing about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is today, could we write a straightforward heroic war story? And maybe, I think you would argue no, right? You would say after World War I, it's not possible to write just a straightforward heroic war story.
Well, it is possible. Yeah, it's possible to write a book about heroism in the Second World War. I just wasn't the type to do that, so I wrote the other side. But I can think, in my library, there's many books about heroism in the Second World War. Not merely in ground fighting, which is what I experienced, but in the bombers and the fighters and things like that.
Yeah. What about humor? You know, I was wondering, I mean, we think of war writing as whether it's heroic or whether it's grim or celebrating friendship, but and irony perhaps. By the way, do you know Voyage to the End of Night, the Céline book? That's a French one, and it's probably the most negative book about war that you could possibly read. There's not one good thing in it. Nothing. No heroism. Nothing. It's just carnage. But I was thinking more sort of humor. You know, like just laughing, whether as a correspondent or as an actual participant. Do you know of any examples of just?
I think the late Joe Heller, one of my favorite people, as well as one of my favorite authors. And I was once on a program sort of like this with Joe, and Bill Styron and others were there, people who had fought or were about to fight on the ground, and Joe fought in the air. And we were all very, very ironic and horrified by war, and so indicated. And he said at one point, I don't know what's wrong with you people. I love the war. I enjoyed it, no end. I was never happier than when I was in the bombers bombing Germany from Italy, or bombing Czechoslovakia from Italy. I suppose the answer is it takes all types. I think being outrageously angry towards reality in the war is the most common experience, but there are plenty of exceptions, and now and then you meet them, as I met Joe Heller.
Which is sort of black humor, right? I mean, but what about you, Jim or Sean?
Well, as you were asking the question, I was actually thinking about Catch-22 and wondering if a book like that could ever be written in today's age with so much mass communications and CNN coverage and, you know, with the immediacy of the event. Could you ever really pull something like that off? I'd love to see someone be able to. I mean, because that was funny, but it was also hugely ironic. I mean, some of the things in Catch-22 were. I mean, he really was making a kind of message. I'll tell you a funny story about Catch-22. When I was in Vietnam at a place called Gonoi Island, it was just a wasteland, and I was hating it. Everybody was hating where we were, and one of my fellow platoon commanders comes running across this perimeter, holding a book, laughing, and I'm going, what is this guy happy about? And he had Catch-22, and he says, read this, and it says, they're in a bar, and somebody's asking Yossarian who the enemy is, and Yossarian says, the enemy is anyone who shoots at me and anyone who sends me out to get shot at.
In other words, everybody.
You know, if you can pull that off, I mean, it's probably the best way to get messages.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting that Ernest Hemingway didn't write a major novel about World War II after his experiences in World War II, and the closest that he came to that was Across the River and Into the Trees, and that has it has a lot of bittersweet moments, and it has some funny parts in it. One of the passages that I chose for Hemingway on war, the chain of command, plays on the chain of command in military code, and then the necessity to listen to your wife or your girlfriend in making a relationship work. So Hemingway also.
So maybe it's also the style, because like there was one where I was reading something from this book of yours the other day, and I was bursting out laughing. It was just so funny, where he says it's about chauffeurs in Madrid. You know, as a correspondent, Hemingway and I guess others were being driven around, and he goes to all the different chauffeurs that he had, and except the last one, who was a really wonderful hero, and so on. But the intermediate one, David, he says, he swore terribly, and then he says, but he had really only one real defect as a chauffeur. He didn't know how to drive a car. And so there I was sitting absolutely, in stitches over this. But it's the way he turned it, the way he turned the phrase. I'm sure it wasn't that funny at the time, since this guy was driving them around without knowing how to drive, right?
There's another story of his.
There's certainly a way that if you've been in ground combat sometime, the only appropriate response to it is black humor. And this is usually kept among the troops and never advertised elsewhere, and never reaches civilianville. But it is the standard attitude of those who have fought a long time and have seen a great many horrors. There's no way of talking about it except to invert the normal reaction totally and regard it as a form of bizarre comedy. Mm-hmm. Enacted by who? We don't know. God, maybe? The president? You have to pick somebody who's the author of this comedy. But I think that's a way into writing about warfare. It's one of the ways you might choose or might become sympathetic to if you wanted to write about war.
And Sean, yeah.
Hemingway's short story, The Butterfly in the Tank, is an interesting example of a case where the human need for levity in a wartime situation. A man comes into a bar and he's squirting people with a squirt gun or a flit gun. And it's in the midst of the Spanish Civil War, and people don't understand what he's doing, and they tell him to stop. And they end up killing him in the bar. And it turns out that he had cologne in the squirt gun, and he was just trying to make a joke. And it's a tragic story, but it involves this sort of human need for levity in times of oppressive war.
Mm-hmm.
Right, although, as you say, it's sort of the butterfly in the tank. When a butterfly meets a tank, it will probably have a bad end, right? I noticed that, actually, and here's a general question. Do you think there's a real difference in genre? You mentioned types of, war writing, and Hemingway wrote this as fiction, right? But then he also wrote, the one about the chauffeurs of Madrid was an article in a sort of a first-person war correspondent essay that he published in Collier's or something, right? So do you think what's the difference between, why publish one thing? And it's really the same thing, Madrid under siege during the Spanish Civil War. So, do you think there's a difference between writing it as a fiction and writing it as nonfiction? And I think Jim also has written both fiction and nonfiction about war. So do you see a difference there in the way it's put together or in anything? Sean?
I think for Hemingway, writing in fiction was an opportunity to make the story as good as it could possibly be. Mm-hmm. The Butterfly in the Tank is based on a true experience, and he still is able to improve on it. I think another interesting aspect, and I think Paul and Jim can speak better to this, is the problem with writing about the truth in war as fact, and the issues of censorship at the time as well. It's something that you comment on in your recent book, the difficulties of being able to portray exactly what's happening at the moment that it's happening without political conflicts of interest.
Yeah, it is more complicated than that, because while you're writing it, you have to think of the audience. are they going to regard this as true writing? And the various things you can do to make your writing sound true or be true, if you like. And you mentioned the paradox that sometimes, fiction becomes absolute truth. And I think there are people who read A Farewell to Arms who imagine that Hemingway was at the retreat from Caporetto, because it's absolutely incredible. And he did it, I think, by talking to as many people as possible, reading as much as possible. In other words, there's an element of what we might even call scholarship in the whole thing. You have to study what sounds true, or what will be taken as a mode of truth, and which might be thought by a literary critic or a philosopher to be the truth, because the individual example is the exception. And putting them all together gives you the truth. But that's very hard to do. About 2 people per generation can do it. Hemingway was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it really depends on what your objective is and when you're writing. And to follow on just briefly to what the professor said, I mean, if any novelist who is writing about an event that has an historical context would do well to do a good bit of study about the historical surroundings for veracity. On my novel, Emperor's General, which is the very end of World War II and the beginning of the Japanese occupation, I studied that off and on for 15 years. The story of Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, probably the greatest Japanese general who was hung as a war criminal by General MacArthur in a kangaroo court. But in terms of novel versus nonfiction, what I was trying to do in Fields of Fire, I could only have done in a novel, because the novel is essentially an escalating moral drama, and it has to be observed by a group of people, none of whom has exactly the same reaction morally or physically to what is going on. Mm-hmm. And what you see is this group of people being confronted with essentially, I don't want to say the normal immoralities of a combat existence in a guerrilla-type war, but a series of escalating events that test their conscience and their emotions. They're all young. The average trooper in my platoon company, when I was a platoon company commander, was probably 19 years old. Mm-hmm. And so in order to do that right, it had to be a novel, because I had to be able to select events and to show the escalation, and then to design characters that were around the perimeter of each one of these events. And in the end, what you have is sort of what Sean was intimating when he said the truth of fiction. I can take you through that and make you comprehend something that otherwise you cannot. Now, if you're going to write a different kind of an observation about a war or a historical event, these days particularly, it's better to go nonfiction. With the advent of home movies and this sort of thing, people aren't reading novels as extensively as they were 20 years ago, but they seem to be very interested in nonfiction.
Mm-hmm. Well, you said the advent of home movies. That's a whole other topic. But what about nonfiction? So you still have, though, the importance of the eyewitness, right, or the war correspondent who is there and who sees things. Let's say, as opposed to somebody who later looks back and writes a nonfiction study, or a more of a historical research study, right? And that would bring me then to my next question, which is, do you think there are great women writers on war and women war correspondents? Do you know of any?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I know that there aren't many women novelists who write about war. At least, well, are there? Well, but that's another question too. So
Martha Gellhorn.
Yeah.
Martha Gellhorn.
Martha Gellhorn, who was
Ernest
Hemingway's wife.
Not how she would want to be described as Ernest Hemingway's wife, but a tag that she often got is one of the great women war correspondents. And
that's right.
I would agree, but she was constricted by journalistic conventions that were dominant when she was writing. Editors insisted that you have seen and were positioned at the place that you've seen what you're writing about, and that you're willing to swear to that.
Ah.
Only now is that beginning to be, with all these people getting fired for lying who work on newspapers, Only now are people getting more subtle about that. You can piece together the truth in a fiction better than any accurate literal report could make it.
Uh-huh.
And that is a problem. It's a problem faced by, all nonfiction writers.
Yeah.
In my book on the First World War, it really is not about the fiction of truth. It's about the truth of fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Because the material I was using was written by poets, very skillful poets, who were very careful to make the lines come out right and so on, and to use only material which readers of poetry would respond to. And they wrote about the war using those terms, but it's amazingly literary. I called one of my chapters, "Oh, what a literary war."
That's right.
And I think that can apply to any war that we have become accustomed to believing we understand to a degree because we've read the books. And we've read the fictions, and we've read the actual reports, and so on. We've put it together with language. And that's a question that constantly tugs at me. What's the relation between language and actuality, if any?
Right.
I think also it's hardly a gender issue. As I was saying in the beginning, it's an issue of being able to observe and be able to make correct judgments about what you're seeing. And actually, Georgie Ann Geyer, I think, is one of the great foreign correspondents of the past 20 or 30 years. She goes all over the world. She looks at situations, she processes it, and she makes some pretty spectacular judgments in the same environment that Hemingway was in as a correspondent in World War II.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the latest issue of the New Yorker, there's a wonderful story, I think we talked about it over lunch with Jim, by a woman named Kathy Gannon on Afghanistan, on the road from Kabul to Kandahar. And she really is in a very dangerous place and writing about it in an absolutely gripping way, which sort of shows you all the complexity. So I think right now, probably there are a number of women who are writing as war correspondents. What about readers? Do you have any readers in mind? For example, do you think, what sort of reader do you think Hemingway had in mind, Sean? Anybody? Men, women? Is it a bad question?
No, I think it's a good question. When I write, I have a truth teller more than an audience. I've never tried to write toward an audience. What I do, though, is, like, for instance, in Fields of Fire, I have my own personal feelings about the Vietnam War, which, I still believe that this was a just war. I will still defend it. The book itself does not deal with the politics of the war. My truth teller when I was writing that book was the Lance Corporal who's the rifleman down there in the 3rd Fire Team going to look at this book and say this is veracity, this is true, or is it something else? And every book that I write, I do have a truth teller in mind.
But it's a person who fought. So
but in another book it might be something else. I just finished this book that's coming out this fall called Born Fighting, which is about the Scotch-Irish people, the whole history of the Scotch-Irish people. It goes back to Hadrian's Wall and moves to today. It's a Scotch-Irish people in America, and the truth tellers there are going to be the members of the culture. Do I make exaggerations, or do I, or have I really nailed this in my research and that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. Paul, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to get back for a minute to the question of the kind of truth that's possible in war fiction. I had an experience about 2 weeks ago. It was because I knew I was coming for this occasion. I read a short story of Hemingway's I'd never read before, and it instantly became one of my favorites. It's called Black Ass at the Crossroads. It is very good, and I was fascinated by the fact that he obviously wrote it during the Second World War, but it was never published. And perhaps you know the history of this. It was never published partly because Hemingway got into considerable trouble playing soldier, indeed playing captain, infantry captain, to a group of resistance people that he gathered. And he got into a lot of trouble for this because a correspondent is not supposed to lead troops, even if he does it well. And this story is so realistic and so credible and so inexplicable in any other way than to believe that Hemingway was there and that it's about him and not somebody else, that he did not publish it during the war.
Mm-hmm.
And it just remains there as a masterpiece. But in essence, it's incriminating, because Hemingway got into considerable trouble for leading troops when he wasn't supposed to be. Mm-hmm. But that fascinated me, because here is a story which pretends to be fiction, but it is true. Mm-hmm. And we know it's true because he didn't want to exhibit it and, become his own prosecutor. Very interesting business, I think. But I think it's a wonderful story as well. Not least from the title, which is superbly bold and imaginative and hits it right there. Black ass. Yeah. Well, if you have black ass, you are extremely guilty and unhappy about something you've done, and you can't get it out of your mind. You've got black ass. Brilliant.
Yeah. Well, yeah, John.
To add to what you were asking about readership and also fact and fiction, and it's interesting, I think, that Hemingway's journalism, beginning in the Spanish Civil War, and even earlier, looking at the earlier journalism, but especially beginning in the Spanish Civil War, like the story you mentioned, The Chauffeurs of Madrid, reads like a story. It reads almost like a fictional story as opposed to a work of journalism. And Hemingway was at the forefront of journalism, I think, at this time, and it's a trend that has continued in reportage today, even today, that this interest in this human interest, this interest in the individual in the war, and I think in his journalism, I think he was hoping for a very wide readership. I mean, he was hoping to get the message out of what was going on in the war to as many people as possible, and I think he must have seen this kind of reportage, this storytelling reportage, as a way of making his message even more accessible to people, as opposed to just the battle statistics or other kinds of information.
And what about the readership? So you think?
I think his readership. He wanted as many people as possible to read his fiction, but also the journalism. I don't think he was just writing for a specific kind of Hemingway reader.
Well, one thing is interesting, that even though in all these war stories there are tremendous battle scenes, and men at war and just men together, and so you would think that it was for mainly a male audience. There are also love stories, right? Does every war story have to have a good love story? I mean, like in Fields of Fire, there's a love story. In Farewell to Arms, famously in For Whom the Bell Tolls, right? The Earth Moved, I think, is that the sentence? Would you think that would appeal to women, or no? That appeals to men as well?
I don't think it would have appealed to any one of Hemingway's women, because it's my understanding that he treated most of them as if they were enlisted men in an infantry company in which he was the commander. And at one point, one of them says, "Don't give me any more orders," and so forth. So I think he had a very special relation with women. But in general, during infantry war is so awful that men have to find pleasures of some kind. One of them is women, and this is one reason war is awful, at least in Europe, because the whole battleground is cleared of females entirely. You don't see a woman at all for months on end. And yet you see the places where you used to have pleasure with women: Paris, Nancy, places like that, were big cities, pleasure cities. And because you were in the business of killing and not risking sustaining life, it was all very curious, very curious. But women were a very large part of the fantasies of the troops.
I think it depends on like any novel, it depends on what you're trying to do, what you're trying to illuminate. For instance, of the books that I mentioned, I thought were among the great war novels. The Shara book on Gettysburg. There's no female characters. I don't think there are any at all in that book. All Quiet. I mean, I've been many years since I read it, but there were glimpses, maybe of the women back in the areas that they rotated through, but there was no real. The females did not play a role. In Fields of Fire, what I was attempting to do was actually not only illuminate the existence there, but show what the stakes were. One of the untold stories of Vietnam, you and I were talking at lunch, that there were more Marine Corps casualties in Vietnam than in World War II, 103,000 killed or wounded. And one of the untold stories was how many of these people volunteered to return to the combat zone when they could have left. And the best way to illuminate that reality was to show that when Hodges, the character in Fields of Fire, returned, he really was giving up something that had become, almost the central part of the other part of his life. So, to show, the power of the decisions that he had to go through. Once an Eagle, by the way, was great, 60 years of, love and loss and that sort of thing. So it's like any other novel where relationships, male-female relationships are important, they're there, and when they're not, they're not.
Right. But I mean, I guess maybe one of the things is that since the emotions are so strong and people are aware that they may die any day, maybe that kind of encourages passion, no? Or not? Is it just... what do you think? Yeah. Yeah. Although, well, for whom the bell tolls, I mean, don't you think that's part of the
absolutely in the novel, but in terms of war itself, the battlefield historically has been dominated by male.
Yes.
Some of us who went through the Second World War and were beaten up by it, when talk in this country began about bringing women into the Army, of all things, I, together with others, hoped that they would be placed in infantry platoons and have to shoot people like other people. And that never happened. Somehow the old feminist myth that they were delicate figures, delicate bodies and so on, persisted. And that disappointed me terribly. There will be the female equality until they can lead infantry companies, in my view. And there's no reason why they can't do that.
I don't know whether women fight in the Israeli army. Good question. Where they've been serving for a long time.
They have not in the past.
Yeah.
They are trained in the different MOSs, but have traditionally served as instructors rather than as fighters in the combat unit.
Right. Although there are casualties. I mean, there was in today's Times, there was that very heartbreaking page of letters by officers and privates. I mean, people in Iraq who wrote letters home and then were killed shortly thereafter. And one of them was a woman private.
I was answering your question about the Israeli army, not the
Yes,
American.
no, right. Yeah. Right, no, I'm just thinking out loud about this. Now, I guess we'll soon be starting to open up the discussion, and I'll be interested to hear whether the women here read a lot of war novels. But one of the questions that I had, one of the other questions was, what about old wars never die? This question comes from the I think you said that, Paul, in one of your, something that I read, that the experience of war is so intense that it stays with you forever. And you will never get over it. And I was wondering about it both individually and then in terms of nations. Are we over the Vietnam War? How soon does a whole people get over a war, or should we ever get over a war?
I think it's easy for non-combatants to get over a war. It is the combatants you have to focus on. It was Audie Murphy, the kid from Texas, who was an infantry lieutenant in the Second War, who once said memorably, if you're a real soldier, you never get over the war. I don't want to be autobiographical, but...
Why not?
I very seldom go to bed at night, even now, 60 years afterwards, without revising for my instruction and my expiation some scene in which I participated in the American infantry in the Second World War. These things do not go away because they are a mode of trauma, I think, unhealed, and that's the way it has to be. And that's why you have to toughen up kids to become soldiers. I mean, infantry training is largely a matter of making people go through embarrassing and awful and losing experiences successfully. And that's what you do in a war. Almost everything you see is disgusting. And almost everything you take part in is guilt-making. And that's the way it is. And if you're going to win the war, that must take place. And you gradually realize winning it is worth it. It's worth all of that.
There are no perfect solutions in a combat environment, which, just adding on to what the professor said, so you never win all the way in your emotions. And I have this theory about time that, time is this convenience that we all use in order to collectively measure, the period. But I wrote in Fields of Fire, if you could be sitting at a company perimeter and there'd be a platoon out on patrol, and if they're in a firefight, they just went through a year while you went through an afternoon.
Right.
And if you spend a year in combat, these young men and women in Iraq right now are being deployed for a year. That's an incredibly, it's such an intense experience that maybe it's the equivalent of 10 years for the people who have been back here. And so it's a huge part of your life, which is the point that I'm trying to make. And you will continue to process it for the rest of your life. And in terms of nations, I think that when you have a war like Vietnam or World War II, or the Civil War, I mean to hit your mic there, where you truly have divisions that rend everyone, then it takes a long time for a nation to process that experience as well. I mean, I had 2 ancestors died in the Civil War, and we still think about it and go to the battlefields and all that sort of thing. So the best thing that you can hope for as a nation is to assimilate the experience in a way that allows people to have their dignity and also to understand what happened.
Yeah, well, Spanish Civil War is one case where I think in Spain it still isn't quite over, right? The memories of that and the divisions that it caused are not necessarily over. Do you think Hemingway ever got over his wars, Sean?
Well, I think no. I think he would agree with what Jim and Paul have just said, and I think it's interesting that a number of his short stories deal with the issue of a soldier returning home after the war and dealing with these issues. And A Soldier's Home is one fantastic story about a soldier coming back from World War I, as early as World War I, and shortly after Hemingway was writing about it, and how the difficulties of an American boy coming back to the Midwest and
Soldier's Home, one of his greatest stories.
Yeah,
I love it.
And now I lay me the difficulties of going to sleep, thinking about combat.
Right, but in a way, at the end of his life, do you think he was almost nostalgic for what the war had given him, or what wars that he had seen had given him?
I don't think he was nostalgic about war. In fact, I'd like to read a brief passage. It's not from the very end of his life, but I think certainly about the camaraderie of war. I mean, he had nostalgia for that, for sure, and then the people, the close bonds that you can make in war with people who you fought with, and friendships that continue beyond the war. But with regards to war itself, I don't think he was nostalgic. And I'd like to read just a brief passage because I think many people probably haven't heard it, because it's from an introduction that he wrote to a book called Treasury for the Free World, and it's comments that he made, and it's some of the last comments that we have from him about World War II, and it's after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is Ernest Hemingway talking about World War II after the advent of the atomic warfare. We have waged war in the most ferocious and ruthless way that has ever been waged. We waged it against fierce and ruthless enemies that it was necessary to destroy. Now we have destroyed one of our enemies and forced the capitulation of the other. For the moment, we are the strongest power in the world. It is very important that we do not become the most hated. We need to study and understand certain basic problems of our world as they were before Hiroshima, to be able to continue intelligently to discover how some of them have changed and how they can be settled now that a new weapon has become a property of part of the world. We must study them more carefully than ever now and remember that no weapon has ever settled a moral problem. It can impose a solution, but it cannot guarantee it to be a just one. An aggressive war is the great crime against everything good in the world. A defensive war, which must necessarily turn aggressive at the earliest moment, is necessary the great countercrime. But never think that war, no matter how necessary nor how justified, is not a crime. Ask the infantry and the dead.
Yes, I was very struck by that. Very, very struck by that. I wonder if we should maybe end on that note here for the more formal part of the conversation and open up the discussion to the public. So if anybody has questions, then we can continue, but I think probably many of you have questions. So would you like to take the mic?
Well, someone's moved to the mic. Let me give you a quick. The reason I was laughing when you mentioned Soldier Home is when I decided that I wanted to write fiction, and I was reading everything I could get my hands on from Hemingway. It's so different between being an appreciator of literature and being a writer. And I read Soldier Home, and I looked at it. I said, "That's not that hard." I'm going to write about when I came home, and I sort of wrote, and I thought I'd done like a Van Gogh, and about 30 minutes later I went and read it, and I'd done Stickman, I said, now I know this is really hard.
Yeah. And incidentally, people who never get over it, we never even talked about that, but maybe we will, people who lose part of their body. I mean, I think I don't see how one can get over something like that. And we've been reading a lot about that recently, about people coming back from Iraq. Okay, I see somebody there. Yes?
Good afternoon. Is this mic on? Is it on?
We can hear you.
I'm sorry.
And also one request, which is to please keep your questions relatively short so that many people can ask them.
Well, let me just preface that the fact that I was a 17-year-old Marine during World War II, didn't see combat, and I was a 23-year-old second lieutenant during the Korean War, and my military service ended in 1960 before the Vietnam War. And I think my question is probably addressed to you, Ms. Suleiman, or to the organizers of this particular forum, which I've appreciated very much. I've read some of the books that they have indicated they have written, or Hemingway's books and so forth. But I'm just wondering, was there nobody who wrote about the Korean War? When we had Schlesinger, we had Michener, John Toland, Isidore Stone, Fehrenbach, Claire Blair, both of them, or all of them, historians who wrote novels. And who can forget The Bridges of Tokaree? Could you possibly address that, possibly?
Or the bridge on the River Kwai, right? Yes. Isn't that?
World War II.
Oh, that's World War II, sorry. Shows you how much I know. Well, okay, Korean War.
I'm not an organizer.
Neither am
I would say that if you read my novel, A Country Such as This, I started in 1951, and there is a good portion of it at the beginning that covers the both the air side and the ground side in Korea. But I do take your point. I mean, I think Fehrenbach the Fehrenbach book is an incredible book. I think people looking at the American military today ought to read that. And I grew up on Michener, Bridges of Tokaree, Sayonara, even before he started writing these big encyclopedias.
Yeah.
I can just say that I think Ernest Hemingway, had his health continued to be good, probably would have written something about the Korean War. And it's interesting, and it's unfortunate that they don't have any comments of his on the Korean War. And perhaps they'll come out of letters. And there's a big letter project underway right now to publish and study all of the letters that he's written. But we don't have anything, and his health took a toll from being wounded in World War I, and then successive wounds in World War II, and then a plane crash in the early 50s. He wasn't able to go again to war.
Mm-hmm. Nobody else has a question. I'd like to impart just one more bit of information.
Okay.
And that would be if you go to Amazon.com or go to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., you will find over 1,000 books and articles written about the Korean War. And one other point I'd like to make, there was a woman war correspondent during the Korean War, known as Marguerite Higgins. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very informative. And by the way, you could line up. You don't have to wait for one person to finish before you line up to ask a question. Yeah.
I have a question, and that is, can language compete with images? Is it harder today to write about war when the airwaves are we are blanketed with the most stark, horrendous images of war? Can you engage the reader in the same way that these images that we see on television or on the screen can do?
I'd like to answer that. At least begin answering it. I think there's a yes and there's a no. The yes is when we're watching this stuff, we're the prisoners of the camera, and so we are the prisoners of where these people are sent in order to tell the story, and that the great stories still are going to be told from the inside of people who have observed this, and I think there will be some really great stuff to come out of modern experiences as well. The no, the difficulty today really is because of the change in mass media over the last 20 years. We are so inundated with choices that it's very difficult to get people to read. I can't get my kids to read. I can't even get them to read my books.
Well, those were the last things they'd read.
Yeah, there'll come a time. I hope that happens. But when you have a DVD in every home, it's the old story. Read a novel, watch a movie, the movie wins.
Mm-hmm. Quite so.
Well, even that, there's a difference, right? There's TV coverage, and then there are narrative films. There are some great, we haven't even talked about that, some really great narrative films of war, which might do competition with novels, or that sometimes are based on novels. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I added a footnote to the matter of the reporting of the ground warfare in the Second World War. Every infantry company that was actually fighting that war had in it one of the officers whose job was to censor the soldiers' letters that went out. And he had in his pocket, and he carried it through rain and mud, a little rubber stamp that said, "Cleared by censor," and a stamp pad. And all those writings had to be cleared of nastiness. So the result was the civilian audience for literature about the war never knew anything about it. They were getting a beautified version of it, full of heroism and the better human motives, and nothing really nasty came to the United States from the line in that war. I gave a little paragraph called "To the Reader" at the end of my last book, which, by the way, is on sale outside. And there I said, "Be very cautious, dear reader, of any account of combat in the Second World War that emanated from the line, because it is false. It has been cleaned up because otherwise it could never be published, could never be sent back to an American newspaper or magazine." And alas, that includes some of the best war reporting of Ernest Hemingway. It's a lot cleaner than the view he's describing.
Mm. Yes.
Professor Fussell, you've written extensively about Siegfried Sassoon, who after World War I was probably the most anti-war of the World War I poets.
Mm-hmm.
And Hemingway, I think it would be fair to say, was not an apologist for war. He understood what it was, as Mr. Hemingway has just read. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could say a word contrasting the views of these two writers.
Yes, Hemingway's had some very acute understandings of the literature that came out of the First World War. He said there was no censorship of it because the bad news about that war was written by poets, and nobody could believe in censoring poets. The correspondents were censored. Novelists, to a degree, were censored. Anybody who wrote prose, but poetry was thought to be so frivolous and so childish and so fairyland that it was never censored. So it was left to these three great poets of the First World War, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, and Edmund Blunden, to tell the vicious truth about that war and about what living in a trench for 6 months while people were trying to kill you with artillery fire was like. The poets did it, which is very ironic and funny.
Yeah. Yes.
What do you think about the American public's current understanding of war, and what would you like the American people to understand better?
War in general, or any particular war?
Current understanding of war in general.
Sometimes I don't hear very well as a result of listening to artillery fire too close for too many years. And by the way, I recently was talking at the Commandant General Staff School of the Army in Fort Leavenworth, and one of the people there that I met and was impressed by was a very young colonel who was stone deaf because he'd been in the artillery. And there were many, many people like that who, instead of losing limbs, lost something that was invaluable and is never noticed, etc. So I didn't hear the question.
Oh, the question was, what does the American public understand about war? What is its current understanding of war in general, as a phenomenon, I guess, or as an activity? And what should it, or what do you think it should have as an understanding? So whoever, Sean, would you like to start?
I'll start. I can speak a little bit to part of the public who hasn't actually participated in a war as a younger person of a younger generation, or fortunately not overseas at the moment. I think this book that I've edited, Hemingway on War, has a lot to say about war, and especially, people who experience war will appreciate it deeply as well, but for people, I found it especially important to me for gaining an understanding of many of the different aspects of war, the psychological and physical impacts of war on people afterwards and during the war. It's a way of reading can be a way of learning about an experience that we haven't had ourselves. And I think war is a subject that we all need to know about and be educated about and understand, and it's unfortunately an aspect of all of our lives.
Jim, do you have any?
That's a really tough question. I mean, I think maybe because I've been, so intimately involved with the military since I was young, and I constantly read, it's a little difficult for me to understand, what the average person in the country might be absorbing these days. But I would say one thing that's concerned me over the past several decades with mass media is that you get the sort of a veneer of understanding about what's going on when you have this immediacy, like in the Iraq situation, but at the same time, you're, as I was saying with respect to the other question, you're sort of a prisoner of where the camera takes you, and so there's on one level, there's a feeling that we fully understand what's going on because we turn on CNN and it's there all the time, but on another level, that level of the type of understanding that we have is when something major occurs or when there's actual cameras there to see it. What we need to spend a lot more time on, in my opinion, is the reasons that we do certain things as a nation, and whether those actions are particularly wise in terms of our relations with other nations and how we want to solve the problems that we say we want to solve.
So you think more public debate about political decisions, rather? Is that what
I don't want to get political today.
Yeah.
But I would say that when you have what's called an elective war, when you really can sit back and decide whether you're going to do something, the reasons for doing it should be so strong that you're either looking at national survival or the international community coming to you saying that this absolutely needs to be done, and that's a very high standard. It's met in the war against international terrorism. I do not believe it was met in the war in Iraq.
Well, that's why I think that the passage that Sean read from Hemingway after the atom bomb was so powerful, where he says aggressive war is all war is a kind of crime, but aggressive war is always a crime. It's a very powerful statement. Okay, yes. Oh, sorry. I guess these lights are blinding me. I don't see. Yes,
Professor.
please.
Yes, Professor, I have a question for you. You spoke about how every evening you relive your experiences before you retire for the evening. I'm wondering, as writers, did any of you delve into the personalities of admirals or generals who participate in many wars? How do they experience their lives? How do they go through with their lives if they go through these many ordeals?
I think they are saved from serious emotion by the necessities of corporate organization, which is what their main attention is directed to. At the moment, I'm working on General Patton from the Second War and asking the question, how did he get that way? Because by the end of the war, he was practically lunatic about the Red Menace and so forth, and loving the Nazis. He turned to love them after killing them.
Really?
Something happened to him, something snapped, and I'm trying to find out what there was in his prior experience, including his education, his reading. He was a very learned and intelligent reader, for one thing, which I'd never realized, but he's a fine example of someone who spent his whole life as a general, practically, and who stayed sane before the war by considering questions of organization and the experience of training and things like that, perfectly harmless, almost collegiate subjects. And it was the war itself that set him off, although he'd been in the First World War, but only for about a couple of days. It's a good question. Yeah.
I would say, if I'd like to say something on that, I don't think that everyone who goes to war is shattered by it, and I think that there are a lot of good reasons to fight, and that good leaders who've gone through this experience have historically floated to the top in this country, in the country's political process. In the book that I just wrote on the Scotch-Irish people, Andrew Jackson was an amazing general, and he fought continuously for about 10 years. If you believe in the validity of what you're doing, and if the people in your community and your country validate the validity of what you're doing, then it gives you a strength of purpose. And I think people like Eisenhower and I could go through a whole string of individuals who at one level or another have had to make those decisions and have retained their strength and all the rest of it are testimony to that. I wrote it's one book, Emperor's General, about MacArthur, and I spent probably 10 years trying to understand the duality of Douglas MacArthur's personality and understand some of the decisions that he made. And MacArthur was an extraordinarily vain man, but no one would ever question, no one but the Marine Corps would ever question his courage. The Marines did not particularly like MacArthur for a number of reasons, but certainly his courage in World War I was evident. And at the same time, he had quirks that would never have allowed him to, say, hold high public office, but this is not someone who was decimated in any way by his war experiences.
Right. So go back to this side.
I had a question about style and the writing about war. I guess my question specifically focused on fiction writing. I think one can draw a pretty strong contrast between the more concise, muscular realism of Hemingway and maybe magic realism in the case of Tim O'Brien. And I was just wondering if you had any opinions about whether a particular style was more effective in writing about war in general or in writing about specific wars, whether certain styles were more effective in handling the specific issues associated with World War I or Vietnam or other wars. Thanks.
Again, here, Hemingway has to take the prize, I think, because he invented a style for writing about war, and I'd call it the fake sincere. It's very, very short sentences and no fancy language at all, and you just give the impression of simplifying what you've seen so that everybody can understand it. The prose of Farewell to Arms is a fine example, but he invented a style for writing about the war. And when you read stuff written in the Second World War, like, say, James Jones, one of my favorites, you find that they cannot escape the influence of Hemingway. He set a style for talking about war, in which you could do horror without really upsetting the reader. You could turn horror into a kind of easily accessible art, but undeniable art. And he's one of the first people who found that formula, and then he passed it on to subsequent 20th century writers, including Norman Mailer.
I think narrative style, again, depends on what the author's purpose is, and in many ways depends on the war. In a lot of cases, and particularly before the immediacy of today, the reader needed to understand the war, either the mechanics of it, or in some cases in historical novels, really what was at play. And so you get more of an external narrative style when you do that. When I was writing Fields of Fire, what I wanted to do was to bring the reader inside the head and the eyes of individual people. When you're moving along a tree line and you get hit, you don't know that there's a battalion over here or a company over here. The way that it's put out in a lot of war novels, all you know is what you're seeing from inside, which is something's happening over here, and you got to figure it out. And, the Vietnam part of the novel begins with one man bleeding outside of a fighting hole trying to crawl back from a listening post, and it ends with one guy staring up in the sky looking at a medevac going away. I would say probably what you're going to see in terms of effective literature and more modern or the more recent conflicts is a tendency toward interior monologue, people really looking at intensely trying to show you something that you haven't picked up on CNN. At the same time, when you get historical novels and that sort of stuff, you're going to end up with more of an external narrative, because one of the purposes of that is to educate the reader as well.
Could I ask another Hemingway question? When you were writing, did you ever have a sense that Hemingway's style was propelling what you were doing, or that you were echoing, or that you were using a secret that he had let out?
When I was learning to write, I read everything I could by Hemingway, by Faulkner, and by Steinbeck for three totally different reasons. Hemingway, as you said, reinvented the narrative style, and there's such a power in his descriptive phraseology, and the way that he liked to say that he liked to use prepositions, he liked to fix things. And Faulkner, because he could really get inside the head of people in a way like no one else could. And Steinbeck, because he was such a marvelous, although sometimes mawkish storyteller. So the three of them really had an impact on me as I reached the point where I developed my own narrative style.
It's interesting.
Good. The gentleman.
I'd like to go back to a previous question, if I may. Do you think that the combat soldier returns to the civilian life as a better person, as better able to contribute to society? In other words, you spoke of General Patton, you spoke of America Caesar, but how about the average GI fighting soldier who returns to civilian life? Thanks.
Interesting question. I would say certain journalistic errors claiming that soldiers become later on brutal civilians is absolutely wrong. Soldiers who return to civil life are instructed in the uses of order, understatement, behavior of all kinds, and I think they make the very best citizens. I'm not saying it's quite worthwhile to have wars so you create a body of nice veterans, but the veterans I've had to do with are model citizens, and I think they might not be if they hadn't had the experience of very serious warfare.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking, maybe, is it, I don't think we can generalize, right? I mean, I think some people really are very deeply disturbed by what happens and may end up in situations that are going to be very negative.
That's certainly true, but others of them have turned into school teachers of distinction.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Jim, did you have...
I think that like the American Indians like to say, even today, that they honor their warriors not because they've killed, but because through a costly experience they gained wisdom and understood what courage was. And there is a good bit of that, I think, in people who have not only have gone through hard ground combat, but who have lost portions of their lives, put their lives at risk in the service of their country, haven't been able to control where they're going to be or what they're going to do, and have had to process a lot of this stuff. We did studies. I was the Minority Counsel on the House Veterans Committee for 4 years, back in the late 70s into the early 80s, when the reputation of the Vietnam veterans was the baby killer, drug doer, etc. And we did really exhaustive surveying on that, and it came out pretty much the other way around, that the people who had gone to Vietnam were less likely to be in jail. Drug issues were a wash, no difference between the rest of the generation. It was a drug-oriented generation, as anyone who is a baby boomer in here knows, but more likely to own a house, etc. But in terms of how you process this emotionally, other than citizenship, how you proceed with your life, it really depends on how your community and your country ratifies your experience. And that really does vary war by war. And for the people who were in Vietnam, these were really serious problems. And I keep up with a lot of guys from my platoon, and you reach a point in your life, where you come back and you're going to charge, I'm going to get my job, I'm going to be a roofer, I'm going to whatever it is. And then you reach a point in your life where you really do say, this is who I am, and I'm going to sit back and reflect. And that's when the stuff from the war comes back to you, and you start breaking it apart, as Professor Fussell says. You start looking at it piece by piece. And I've had a number of people out of my rifle platoon who have had emotional difficulties.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, Sean.
There's a wonderful passage in A Farewell to Arms that speaks a little bit to this, and I just want to read it, just a couple sentences. If people bring so much courage to this world, the world has to kill them to break them, so of course it kills them. The world breaks everyone, and afterward many are strong at the broken places. But those that will not break, it kills. It kills the very good and the very gentle and the very brave impartially. If you are none of these, you can be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry. Now, this is in the context of a war novel, but it's also a more general statement about life.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Stephen Good, and I'm a history teacher. So I think the other gentleman provided an excellent segue for my question. I have a twofold question. First, in both of your experiences in war, and you brought them back to the United States, what do you think the African American experience was, and what are they living 10 years? You mentioned it's almost like living 10 years in that battle. So what was your experience with the African American troops in either of the wars, in any of the wars? And the second question is, because of modern technology and bringing the television, bringing the war to your living room, start with Vietnam, do you think it would have played a greater role in maybe ending war in the earlier wars? Do you feel that the media played more of a role in stopping wars, or so that the general public that's not experiencing that would have a greater cause to say, let's end war?
I can try and answer the second question by asking a question. I think television is quite irrelevant because it never shows you the spectacle of a soldier with his head shot off and the reaction of his friends to that event. And until it does that, it cannot equal letterpress in conveying something like the horror of war. I missed the first question. Maybe
the first question was, what was your experience, or what do you know about the African American experience of soldiers in World War II, or any war that you would like to discuss? And
I know
quite
a lot about it because I was in the midst of infantry units, which halfway through the war had been decimated, and they'd been cut down to half their size. And here were all these black soldiers doing nothing but carrying weights from boats to trucks who could have been used as replacement soldiers. And so many of them were taken behind the line. They were given infantry training, and they did very well, to the surprise and horror of a great many old-fashioned people. And that's all I know about it. But it was discovered that the black units were wonderful as long as they were units. There was still no attempt to really integrate the service, but they fought well as units if they were led by a black officer.
I'll bring that up to the Vietnam era and a little bit beyond. I was fortunate. I grew up in the military. My family's from the American South. The United States military, for all of its flaws and all of the accusations that were made during that period, was the first institution in this country that was racially integrated. It was racially integrated in 1948. And I grew up on the bases in a racially integrated environment. I was a boxer for 8 years, so I was in pretty much a black-dominated sport. And there were very few problems when I was growing up. The same thing at the beginning of the Vietnam War. As the Vietnam War progressed, the issues that were playing out here inevitably played out also inside the military, and there was something of a sea change in race relations after Martin Luther King was killed. It was a tremendous amount of a different kind of radical self-consciousness among some elements of the African Americans in the military. In my personal experience, first of all, the issue of minority casualties. I want to be fair here. It's been overplayed. African Americans were 13.1% of the age group, 12.6% of the military, and 12.2% of the casualties. They contributed equally to their membership in society. And in my unit, the units that I was in, I never had a racial incident. Out in the field, or what we used to say in the bush, almost all of these distinctions went away, other than in sometimes two individuals, whether they were two whites or two blacks or a Hispanic and whatever. You get individual confrontations, but that was the most apolitical and racially neutral environment I've ever been in. In terms of your second question about the power of media, I actually thought during Gulf War I that if that war had gone on for 6 months, that the nation would have been burnt out emotionally, because when the combat starts, everybody turns on CNN and you just can't get away from it. I'm a little worried now that it's the other way around, quite frankly. I don't know how this is going to play out. I don't pretend to know, but it seems now that we have sort of absorbed our daily measure of casualties almost the same way that we did during Vietnam, although the casualty levels during Vietnam were so much higher. We were losing 200 to 400 people a week when I was in Vietnam. But I worry that it's sort of numbed us rather than made us more aware. I would hope it's the other way around.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting, actually, that maybe exposure, instead of creating indignation, just makes people numb, what you said. Is
Perhaps
that what
over
you
time.
mean? Yeah.
Mm.
Yes.
This question is for Mr. Webb. I'm assuming that you may know the Vietnam War memoir, Fortunate Son by Lewis Pullard, Jr., maybe even knew the author. The question is this. What did you think of that book? If you liked it, what did you like about it? If you didn't like it, what are your concerns about the book?
I did not read the book, but I did know Lou Pullard very well, and I had a great deal of regard for him. He was a gentle soul.
I brought it up simply because it's a good example of somebody who lost both his limbs to one of those landmines.
Actually, was a legitimate quadruple amputee. He lost pieces of both hands as well. Mm. And he had you can imagine the expectations in Lewis Pullard as the son of the most famous Marine in history too.
Mm.
Which is what the book's very much about. So anyway, just wondering what a Marine thought of it. Great.
What did you think of the book?
I thought it was a great book, and it depended very much on, of course, his relation to his father. But I wondered whether the book was dependent on older techniques of presentation. I was wondering what you thought of that, since you were a Marine. But.
I'm sorry, I did not read the book.
Okay. So we have one more question. Time for one more question. Do we have one more question? Yes. Again, I'm blinded. Sorry about that. Yes, I do see you now.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if this is a question or comment, but it follows on some of the remarks that Mr. Webb has made about television. When I got back from Vietnam and watched television, I thought it was silly. I thought it bore no relationship whatsoever to my experience in ground combat. And when I watch CNN Today or Fox News or any other channel, I get the impression that I'm missing 99% of what's going on. It seems probable to me that the American public believes something that isn't true. The American public may believe they know what it's like, but you can't get that on television. At least I've never seen it. I don't mean to impugn the courage of some of the correspondents or their conscientiousness. I think their medium, however, filters out reality. At least that was my experience when I watched the stuff.
Bravo to you. You know, I was trying to say earlier about we are the prisoners of the camera. It was more true when we were in Vietnam. We almost never saw media out where I was in Vietnam. The contact that we had was usually platoon, company-sized contact. It wasn't something that interested the people in New York. And I'll say, by the way, if people want to there's one documentary that I would recommend that is really, really good about Vietnam. It's called Face of War. A British crew went in and spent 97 days with one rifle company, one Marine rifle company, and there's no narrative voiceover whatsoever. They let these people speak and experience, and it's really good. Other than that, I know of nothing. And I would fully agree with what you said today, as I was attempting to say earlier, that we become the prisoners of where the camera goes.
Well, I think that just proves how important, as Paul Fussell was saying, how important writing is, because maybe we can get at greater truths through writing. And thank you so much. All of you have contributed to that writing, and thank you to the audience for your participation.
Thank you.